So this is the opposite to perfect competition. It's monopoly now. And the assumptions of the monopoly model. Well, firstly, a monopoly is when there's just one firm in the industry or the market. So the firm is the industry, and therefore they have 100% market share. So the assumptions are that there are high barriers to entry, the firm is the industry, the product that they're selling is unique, can't get it elsewhere, and that they are a price maker. And because they're a price maker, they're going to face a downward sloping demand curve. So this is what the model for a monopoly looks like. We've got downward sloping demand, and therefore marginal revenue will be twice as steep. And we've got our normal cost curves, average cost and marginal cost there. And the long run position or long run output of a monopoly is taking into consideration they're going to be profit maximizers. So they're going to produce where marginal cost intersects marginal revenue, and this is going to be the output. And then to shade in the supernormal profit, you just go up and across for the price, and then where it's intersected the average cost is where it creates the square for supernormal or abnormal profit. So, are monopolies good or bad? Well, generally speaking, they charge higher prices and they produce lower output to the market than the competitive equilibrium, which would have been here. So we would have had a much lower price and much higher output. So there's less consumer surplus, less producer surplus, so there's loss of allocative efficiency. There's less competition, so this means that there's no incentive really to lower costs, and you might find that firms are producing at a poor quality as well and offering poor customer service because they are producing a unique product, so customers can't go elsewhere. However, we might find that it's a chance for them to be large and gain from economies of scale, and that's going to have implications. I'll show you a diagram of that later on. And they are going to make supernormal profits. However, they could reinvest these, and this could facilitate innovation, and they can have dynamic efficiencies, gain from dynamic efficiencies. Natural monopolies. Now these occur when fixed costs are a very high proportion of total costs. So thinking about the train line, you know, laying all of those train tracks, that would be a very high fixed cost. Canals as well, very high fixed costs of digging out all of those canals, but you know, the kind of operating and running costs would be relatively low compared to the actual physical creation of those. Now, because fixed costs are a really high proportion of total costs, and we know when, you know, fixed costs are high proportion, that it means that the MES is moved, the minimum efficient scale is moved to the right. So we see that there are large benefits to be gained from economies of scale, and your costs, average costs are decreasing for a large amount of output. So we find with natural monopolies that they can only cover their costs if they operate on a large scale, because with natural monopolies, the only assumption here is that fixed costs are a high proportion of total costs. It doesn't state that there'll also be lots of demand in the market. Demand will just be kind of normal, as it would be for any good or service. So here we have average revenue and marginal revenue looking normal, the same that I've drawn them in other diagrams, but we have here marginal cost and average cost, and you know, if you kept on drawing these, eventually this average cost would pick up and this marginal cost would intersect it, but because fixed costs are a really high proportion of total costs, we're not going to see that happen for quite a while. So the monopolist would produce at this point because it's where marginal cost intersects marginal revenue, and here's their supernormal profit in the red. But if we compare it to the competitive output where marginal cost intersects average revenue, this would be where a competitive market would produce, or a competitive firm in a market would produce. And all of the firms together would produce this output. And the problem with that is that it's below the average cost. So this green box here represents the loss that would be made from a natural monopoly. So the government kind of have two choices. They can either let this monopoly exist, because isn't it better to have the product provided than not provided, or they can make up the loss for these firms and subsidise it. But, you know, it depends upon whether the government have enough money to be able to do that. We also can get situations where actually the monopoly is benefiting from dynamic efficiencies or economies of scale, and it actually means that their marginal cost curve is different to the marginal cost curve that competitive market would have. So we've got competitive supply here, and we've got monopoly marginal cost curve here, and we see if we, I'll just go actually get my pen tool out, if we look at them, so they're going to produce at this point here where marginal cost equals, because this is their marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So with this output, and we produce, call it P2 there, Q2 is the output and the price that the monopoly would charge. But in a competitive market, they're going to produce where marginal cost intersects the demand curve, and we're going to see that a competitive market actually produces an equilibrium with a higher price and smaller quantity. So that's less allocatively efficient actually than the monopolist is producing. So onto this last part, and this is something, it's not directly on the specification, but this is something that some of my students have asked me, and they say theoretically, can they be efficient? So first of all, let's look at productive efficiency. So to be productively efficient, all you have to do is produce at this point. Now we know that a monopoly is going to want to produce where it's profit maximizing. So for them to be productively efficient, all points would have to intersect on the marginal revenue curve, which theoretically could happen, but it would be, you know, very coincidental, wouldn't it, that it happens at that point. And also remember that they're more likely to be kind of operating at this point really, because they're limiting supply. Firstly, as a monopoly to maximise their profits, and there's no incentive to reduce the average cost. So their average costs probably are a lot higher in real life than the kind of average cost curve, which would be at the productively efficient point intersecting marginal revenue would be. So yes, theoretically they could be productively efficient, but it's really unlikely. Can they ever be allocatively efficient? Not if they've got downwards demand and they're a price maker, because we see marginal revenue is separate from the average revenue, and the monopolist is always going to try and profit maximize, so you can never get it being allocatively efficient, unless that was their goal, to be allocatively efficient. You know, they're like a social enterprise or something. If their primary objective is profit maximization, then no, they're not going to be allocatively efficient.